The lantern had been burning for 6 hours. Rosa Lockhart knew this because she had watched it from the ridge, that single flame swaying in the black throat of the Colorado night, held aloft by a man she had called a drifter, a stranger, a nobody. She had said those words to his face not 3 days before, and now he was standing in the mud in the howling dark, arm raised, lantern blazing, so that her wagon wheels might find the road that the storm had swallowed whole. Her chest cracked open at the sight of it. Not because it was beautiful, though it was. Not because she was cold and frightened and lost, though she was all of those things, but because she had told him to leave. She had looked him straight in his sun-darkened eyes and said she didn't need a drifter's charity, didn't need a man with no fixed address and no clear past making himself useful around her property like he owned some piece of it. She had said the words with enough ice in them to freeze a summer creek, and he had stayed anyway. He had not stayed in the defiant way a prideful man stays to prove a point. He had stayed in the quiet way a man stays when he cannot physically bring himself to leave someone in danger, when some force deeper than his own comfort and far more powerful than her rejection simply would not let his boots walk away. He had taken the lantern from her barn, lit it with careful hands, and walked out into the teeth of the worst storm the Colorado Territory had seen since 1878, and he had held that light high all night so her wagon could find the road home. Rosa had not known any of this when she set out from Durango in the fading afternoon light. She had not known the storm was coming with such fury. She had not known the road markers would be gone, swept clean off their posts by wind strong enough to rattle the iron hinges on her wagon's canvas frame. She had not known her lead horse, the dependable bay she called Solomon, would throw a shoe in the dark and begin to limp. And she had not known that when despair finally settled over her like a cold, wet blanket, and she pulled Solomon to a halt and sat there in the hammering rain wondering whether she would freeze or simply disappear into the dark forever, she would see a light. One small, fierce, unwavering light. She drove toward it the way a drowning person swims toward a thrown rope, not thinking, just moving. And when her wheels finally found the packed dirt road and she followed that lantern through the last mile of darkness and into the yard of her own homestead, she pulled Solomon to a stop and sat there with rain dripping off the brim of her hat, staring down at Vernon Cooper. He lowered the lantern slowly. His arm was shaking. It had been raised for so long that the muscles had gone from burning to something past burning, past feeling entirely. His face was unreadable in the rain. He was soaked through his canvas coat, his hat dark with water, his boots deep in mud. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has guarded all night and is now profoundly relieved to see safe. He said nothing. Rosa climbed down from the wagon. Her legs were stiff and cold and she nearly lost her footing in the mud, and his free hand shot out and caught her elbow without hesitation, steadying her, and she felt the warmth of his grip even through the soaking wool of her sleeve. She looked up at him. Rain was running down his jaw. "You stayed," she said. It was not an accusation. It was barely even a statement. It was something between a question and a confession. "Yes," he said. She had been preparing a speech during that long, frightening drive. A speech about stubbornness and gratitude, and the complicated business of owing something to a man she had told to leave. But standing there in the rain with his hand on her elbow and that lantern between them casting its brave little circle of gold, every rehearsed word left her completely. She said, "I told you to go." "You did," he agreed. "Why didn't you?" Vernon Cooper looked at her for a long moment. The rain had softened somewhat, dropping from a roar to a steady hiss. Somewhere in the barn Solomon shifted and blew out a tired breath. "Because the road is dark," he said simply, "and you didn't know it yet." That was where everything truly began. Not in any dramatic explosion of feeling, not with a kiss in the rain, but with those plain words and that unextinguished lantern and the enormous, terrifying realization that Rosa Lockhart, who had sworn she needed nothing from any man living, had been wrong about at least one of them. To understand how she arrived at that rain-soaked yard in the autumn of 1882, You had to go back 4 months to the July morning, when Vernon Cooper first rode into the town of Halcyon Creek, Colorado, on a horse that had clearly been rode harder and longer than its rider cared to admit. Halcyon Creek was the kind of settlement that appeared on territorial maps but barely justified the ink. It had a general store run by a widow named Hazel Briggs, a livery stable that smelled strongly of both horses and the whiskey its owner drank while working, a post office that doubled as the sheriff's office, and a collection of houses and homesteads scattered along the creek like seeds thrown carelessly from a passing wagon. The nearest real town of consequence was Durango, 18 miles south over roads that turned treacherous in bad weather and barely passable in good. Vernon rode in on a roan gelding with a name nobody knew yet, and tied him at the livery with the unhurried manner of a man who was not planning to stay, but who also wasn't planning to rush his leaving. He was somewhere in his early 30s, lean in the way men get lean when they spend more time moving than eating, with dark eyes that seemed to be doing a quiet calculation of everything they looked at. He had no outstanding warrants, no known enemies in the territory, and nothing remarkable about him except a habit of offering help before it was asked for, and a singular inability to look away from trouble that wasn't his business. He heard about Rosa Lockhart on his first day in Halcyon Creek, from Hazel Briggs at the general store, in the manner that small settlements communicate everything important about their residents, which was without being asked. "You're looking for work," Hazel said, eyeing him with the direct appraisal of a woman who had seen every variety of drifter pass through. "I could use a few weeks of it," Vernon admitted. He was buying salt, coffee, and a new length of rope, the necessities of a man who lived outdoors by habit. "Rosa Lockhart's got a homestead 2 miles north on the creek. Lost her husband this past spring. Fever." Hazel paused to let that register. "She's got 160 acres. A small herd, and more work than one woman can manage. She's also about as welcoming to help as a scorpion is to being picked up, so I'll warn you right now she'll likely run you off the property before you finish your first sentence." "What does she need most?" Vernon asked. Hazel looked at him with something approaching approval. "Fence posts along the north pasture. The winter before last took out 3 sections and the cattle have been wandering into Callaway's land. Callaway's been patient, but nobody's patience lasts forever out here." Vernon paid for his goods and rode north along the creek. Rosa Lockhart was on her roof when he arrived. This was the first thing he saw: a woman in a work dress with her hair pulled back and a hammer in her hand, replacing shingles with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided the job was getting done today regardless of what the universe had to say about it. She was 28 years old, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had probably been considered conventionally pretty before Colorado and hard seasons had given it something more interesting than prettiness. She had green eyes that people tended to remember after meeting her. She looked down at him from the roof with no particular alarm and no welcome. "Whatever you're selling," she said, "I'm not buying." "Not selling anything," Vernon said. He looked at the fence line he could see from where he sat his horse. 3 sections down at minimum, maybe 4. "I heard you might have work." "Who told you that?" "Hazel Briggs." Rosa drove a nail with 3 precise strokes. "Hazel Briggs should concern herself with her own affairs." "She might," Vernon agreed. "But she didn't. I can replace those fence sections for a fair wage and meals, or just meals if the money's tight." Rosa looked at him steadily. "I don't know you." Vernon Cooper, out of New Mexico originally, more recently just out of wherever the last job was. Something shifted very slightly in her expression, not softening. Something more like an honest assessment being conducted. "You know fence work." "Fence work, roof work, horse work, field work, most kinds of work if we're being thorough." She went back to her shingles. "There's a bunkhouse, suppers at 6, you're on trial, first sign of trouble and you're gone." That was the beginning of it, although neither of them would have called it that at the time. Vernon spent 3 days on the fence before she spoke to him at length. He worked steadily, without complaint, from first light until the failing of it. eating the meals she left on the bunkhouse step without comment and returning his empty plate to the same spot. He was, Rosa admitted to herself on the third evening, a good worker, more than good. He worked with the focused competence of a man who understood land and what it cost to maintain it, who set a post straight the first time and drove a staple cleanly and did not waste motion or material. On the fourth morning, she brought his coffee out to the fence herself instead of leaving it at the bunkhouse. She held it out to him without preamble. He took it with a nod. "Where were you before New Mexico?" She asked. "Kansas, before that Texas." "Why did you leave Texas?" Vernon drank his coffee and looked out across the morning pasture where her small herd of 20 cattle stood in the low golden light. "Various reasons." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She waited, but he didn't expand on it, and she found to her irritation that she respected that more than she would have respected an easy explanation. Easy explanations in her experience were usually the ones that hid the most. "My husband was from Texas," she said. "His name was Emmett Lockhart. He came to Colorado in 1877 and built this place. I came out to marry him in 1879. She paused. "He died in April. Influenza." Vernon said nothing, and she found she was grateful for that too. People had been saying things about Emmett's death for 4 months, and she was deeply tired of all of them. "I have no intention of losing this homestead," she said. "Emmett built it. I intend to keep it." "I understand that," Vernon said quietly. "Do you?" She looked at him directly. "Because most people seem to think a widow alone on 160 acres is a problem that needs solving by somebody else taking over. I am not a problem to be solved. I am a woman who needs her fence fixed." The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. "Then I'll fix your fence," he said. He stayed for the fence. Then she asked him to look at the barn roof, which had its own problems, and he stayed for that. Then there was the question of the creek irrigation channel that Emmett had started digging and never finished, and she asked if he knew anything about irrigation work, and he said he knew enough, and she said she supposed he could stay a while longer. Summer deepened and stretched. Vernon worked and Rosa managed, and gradually, with the extreme caution of two people who had both learned wariness the hard way, they began to talk. Not about important things at first. About weather and cattle prices and the news that arrived in Durango's paper, which Hazel Briggs received and shared in the way that people share things they know will be wanted. About the territorial governor's latest proclamation and the railroad's slow crawl westward and what it might mean for land prices. Then, eventually, about important things. Rosa told him about her life before Colorado in pieces, never a sustained narrative, always fragments offered carefully like something breakable being passed across a table. She had grown up in Missouri, one of 4 daughters of a schoolteacher who believed in educating his children regardless of their sex, which had given Rosa a mind that was perhaps not ideally suited to the social expectations placed upon women of her era, and which had made finding a husband in Missouri somewhat complicated. Emmett Lockhart had been different. Emmett had liked her sharp edges. He had written to her after a mutual acquaintance introduced them by correspondence, and his letters had been full of respect and good humor, and she had come to Colorado to marry a man she had known only through paper and ink, and had found him precisely as advertised, which she counted as the great good luck of her life. "Did you love him?" Vernon asked one evening. They were sitting on the porch after supper, which had become a habit without either of them declaring it one. The creek made its endless patient sound in the dark. Rosa was quiet for a moment. "I came to love him," she said carefully. "I respected him first, admired him. The love came after. It was real when it came." "I'm sorry you lost him." "So am I." She looked at the creek. "He would have liked you." Vernon received that in silence. After a moment he said, "What makes you say that?" "He had no patience for show," Rosa said. "He respected people who worked without needing applause for it. That's not common." The silence between them was comfortable in a way that surprised her each time she noticed it. She had not expected to find comfortable silences with anyone for a long time. She was starting to want things she had not planned on wanting. This frightened her considerably. Vernon's past came out slowly too, and not all of it came easily. He had grown up in West Texas, the son of a rancher who worked land that was dry and resistant, and who had communicated with his sons primarily through expectation and silence. Vernon had 3 brothers, 2 of whom still worked the family land and one of whom had gone to California and not been heard from in years. He had worked cattle drives in his 20s, the long punishing trails up from Texas into Kansas, sleeping on hard ground and eating dust, and learning the precise geography of the American interior in the way that only people who have crossed it on horseback truly know it. He had been married once. He said this on a Tuesday evening in early September and then stopped speaking in a way that invited either silence or a question. Rosa chose the question. "What happened?" "She left," he said, 18 months in. "She went back to her family in Kansas." A pause. "I don't blame her. I was on the trail more than I was home. That life doesn't make for good husbanding." "Did you love her?" "I thought I did," Vernon said. "Looking back, I think we were both young and neither of us knew ourselves well enough yet to know what we actually needed." He looked at his hands. "I know myself better now." Rosa thought about this. "And what do you need?" He looked at her then, and the look was careful and direct and contained something she was not yet ready to name. "Something worth staying for," he said quietly. She looked away first. Her heart was doing something she hadn't given it permission to do, and she was not ready to have that conversation. But the conversation was coming. They were both too honest for it not to. In September, a man named Gerald Forsyth rode up to the property, and the whole situation with the homestead became suddenly, urgently complicated. Forsyth was a land agent out of Durango, broad-shouldered, well-dressed by frontier standards, with the smooth, confident manner of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through the application of money and legal complexity. He represented a ranching consortium that had been quietly buying up homesteads in the Halcyon Creek area and consolidating them into larger holdings. He was polite. He was persistent. And the offer he made Rosa for her land was, she had to admit to herself, generous. She told him no. He came back 2 weeks later with a higher offer. She told him no again. After his second visit, Vernon found Rosa at the kitchen table with her account book spread out before her, and an expression on her face that he had not seen before, which was the expression of someone doing arithmetic that keeps coming out wrong. "He's raising the offer," Vernon observed, pulling out the chair across from her without being invited and sitting down. She looked up. Under other circumstances, she would have pointed out that she hadn't asked him to sit. She didn't. He doubled it. And she pressed her fingers to her forehead. And it would clear the debts from Emmett's illness completely. The doctor, the medicines, the time lost. She paused. "And leave enough over to go somewhere and start again." "But you don't want to go somewhere and start again." "No," she said. "I want to stay here. This is Emmett's land. This is where I belong." Vernon was quiet for a moment. "Do you know why Forsyth wants this specific parcel?" She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "A consortium buying up scattered homesteads could use them for grazing, sure. But Forsyth's been back twice in 2 weeks for your land specifically. That's not standard consolidation behavior." He paused. "The creek," Rosa frowned. "What about it?" "Your property controls the best water access for about 4 miles. Whoever owns this land controls the water rights for everything north of here. That's not just about grazing. That's leverage over every other small operation in this valley." She stared at him. The arithmetic rearranged itself in her head into something much more alarming. He'd cut off the other homesteaders' water, or charge what he liked for access. Yes. She closed her account book with a sharp snap. He can double his offer again and it won't matter. The resolve in her voice was absolute, and it was not born of stubbornness. Vernon understood, but of something principled and deep. He felt something move in his chest, something warm and solid that he recognized as admiration so intense it had begun to look like love. That was the moment he understood he was in trouble. He told himself several useful lies over the following days. that he was an employee of limited duration, that his feelings were the natural result of proximity and isolation. That Rosa Lockhart was a woman of clear vision and strong will who had already made her situation regarding drifters abundantly plain, and that reading anything into evening porch conversations was the kind of foolishness he was too old and experienced to indulge in. These lies lasted approximately until the afternoon he came in from the north pasture to find her sitting in the yard with a letter in her hand and tears running silently down her face. He had never seen her cry before. He hadn't been sure she did. He stopped. She didn't look up, but she was aware of him the way a person is always aware of someone they've grown accustomed to, that particular peripheral certainty of presence. "My sister," she said, without him asking. "In Missouri. She has a daughter, a little girl." She folded the letter with care. "I haven't seen them in 3 years." He sat down on the yard fence, not close, not crowding her, just present. "Do you miss Missouri?" he asked. "I miss my sister. I don't miss Missouri." She wiped her face with the back of her hand in a single decisive motion, the gesture of someone who had allowed herself a limited amount of feeling and was now closing the faucet. "I chose this life. I don't regret it." "You can miss someone and not regret anything," Vernon said. She looked at him. Something in his face, some quality of quiet understanding that didn't ask anything of her, made her eyes fill again and she looked away furiously. "Don't be kind right now," she said. "I can't manage it." "All right," he said. He was quiet. After a moment he said, "I'll go check the irrigation channel." She nodded. He stood and walked away, and she let herself cry properly for exactly 3 minutes, which was all she permitted herself, and then she folded the grief back into its compartment and went to start supper. But she noticed, over the following days, that he had cut wildflowers and put them in a tin cup on the kitchen windowsill. He never mentioned it. She never mentioned it. But she looked at them every morning and felt something in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular tenderness of being cared for by someone who was not asking for anything in return. It was in early October that she made her mistake. Forsyth had come again, the 3rd time, and this time he had brought a lawyer from Durango and a document, and the document was not an offer. It was a notice of a prior claim dispute on the northeastern corner of the property, a claim that Forsyth's consortium was asserting on the basis of a survey discrepancy from 1876. The claim was almost certainly fabricated or at minimum aggressively interpreted, but it was filed with the Territorial Land Office, and it would require a legal response, and legal responses cost money that Rosa did not have in surplus. She was furious. The fury was clean and cold and useful, carrying her through the conversation with Forsyth and the lawyer with absolute composure, but after they rode away she stood in the yard for a long time doing nothing, which was not like her at all. Vernon had been repairing the barn door and had seen Forsyth and the lawyer arrive and leave. He came to stand beside her at a considerate distance. "Bad news," he said, not a question. "He's filed a claim dispute, northeastern corner." She described it. Her voice was steady and precise and did not crack on any word. "It'll tie up the land office for months. And if he finds a sympathetic ear in the courthouse, which money tends to find, he could cloud the title enough to make the property nearly impossible to deal with. You need a lawyer. I need money for a lawyer. What does Emmett's original deed look like? Dates and survey marks. I know exactly what it looks like." She turned to him. "Vernon, Emmett filed that claim in 1877. He had it properly surveyed. The documentation is in order. Then you have a case." He paused. "What you need is someone to take it to the land office in Durango and make sure the filing gets the right attention." She looked at him steadily. "I was going to go tomorrow. I'll go with you." And here was where Rosa Lockhart made her mistake. Not a malicious mistake. Not even a truly unreasonable one given everything she knew about herself and the world, but a mistake born of that deeply embedded fear she carried, the fear of needing someone, the fear of being wrong about someone, the fear of the particular vulnerability that came from allowing a person to matter. She said, "I don't need you to come." He accepted this without visible hurt. All right. I've managed this property alone for 6 months, she continued, and now the words were coming faster than she intended, propelled by something defensive and frightened. I don't need a drifter involving himself in my legal affairs. I appreciate your work here, Vernon, but the fence is finished and the barn roof is solid and the irrigation channel is done, and I think it's probably time we both acknowledged that there isn't really a reason for you to continue staying here. There it was, the thing she had been building to without knowing she was building to it. The preemptive wound, the self-protective strike she made before anyone could make it against her. Vernon looked at her for a long moment. His expression was entirely unreadable, and then something moved through it, brief and deep, something she was too frightened to look at directly. "If that's what you want," he said. "It is," she said. He nodded once. He went to the bunkhouse and he packed his things, which took no more than 15 minutes because he had always lived in the way of a man who kept himself ready to move. He brought his roan gelding out of the barn and saddled it with the same unhurried competence he brought to every physical task. He came back to the yard where she was standing, still standing, rigid with the determination not to change her mind. He touched the brim of his hat. "Good luck with the land office," he said. His voice was even and held no accusation whatsoever, and that evenness cost him considerably more than it showed. He rode out. Rosa went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the tin cup of wildflowers on the windowsill, and felt the most profound wrongness she had felt since the morning she had woken up to find Emmett cold beside her. And she told herself it would pass, and she told herself she had done the right thing, and she told herself all the useful lies a person tells themselves, and not one of them worked. She went to Durango the next morning. The legal matter went reasonably well. She had the documents in order and Emmett's surveyor's marks were clear and detailed, and the land office clerk told her that the dispute claim was thin and would likely be resolved in her favor within 60 days, which was not quick but was manageable. She did the business in town she needed to do. She bought supplies at the general store. She ate a bowl of soup at a restaurant on the main street and sat alone at a corner table and refused to feel sorry for herself. She started back for Halcyon Creek in the mid-afternoon, which she knew was later than ideal. The sky had been wrong all day, that particular flat, heavy color that people who lived in the mountains learned to distrust. And by the time she was 5 miles north of Durango, the wind had picked up into something serious, and the light was failing faster than it should have. She pushed Solomon and the wagon harder, and the first real rain came down just as the road markers vanished. The markers were wooden posts set at intervals along the main route, painted with white bands so they could be seen in poor visibility. She had been watching for them, and then there was a stretch of darkness, and she realized with a cold drop in her stomach that she had missed one, or it was gone, or she had somehow drifted from the road into the empty scrubland without noticing the transition in the dark and the rain. She stopped. She could not go forward in random directions on unknown ground at night in a storm with a wagon and a horse. The risk of a broken wheel or a broken leg, the horse's or her own, was too real. She could not go back because she had lost her sense of which direction back was. The storm was genuinely dangerous. Colorado nights in October could kill a person if they were wet and exposed and without shelter, and she was both wet and exposed with no shelter available. She sat in the driving rain on the wagon seat and did something she had not done since the morning Emmett died, which was to pray without restraint or dignity, to pray with the full raw desperation of someone who had run out of options. And then she saw the light. One light. Steady and small and absolutely certain of itself in all that howling darkness, as though the darkness had no particular opinion about it one way or another. She had no idea where it was coming from or what it meant. She knew only that it was a fixed point in a world that had dissolved into undifferentiated blackness and wet, and she drove toward it. The light moved. It was being carried. Whoever held it was walking parallel to a road she could not see, and they were walking slowly enough that she could follow. And as she followed, She felt her wagon wheels find the packed firmness of the proper road surface beneath the mud, and she followed the light through what felt like an enormous amount of time and darkness and cold rain, until the light stopped moving, and she recognized through the curtain of rain the familiar dark outline of her own barn. She pulled Solomon to a stop and climbed down. Vernon lowered the lantern slowly. His arm was shaking from 6 hours of holding it aloft. He was soaked through entirely, and he was watching her with an expression she could now see clearly for what it was because she had stopped being afraid of seeing it. "You stayed," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. Rain ran down his jaw. She thought about everything she had said to him in that yard 2 days ago and felt shame rise in her, hot and clarifying. "I told you to go," she said. "You did," he agreed. "Why didn't you?" "Because the road is dark," he said, "and you didn't know it yet." She stood in the rain and looked at this man who had packed his belongings and ridden away when she told him to, and then come back and spent the night in a storm holding a lantern high so she could find her way home. And she thought that in 36 hours she had received more evidence of a person's character than she had received about most people in years. Because it was easy to be good when things were comfortable. It was easy to be generous when there was no cost to it. What Vernon Cooper had done was simple and enormous, and it made every defensive wall she had built in the last 6 months feel simultaneously necessary and completely beside the point. "Come inside," she said. "You'll freeze." She fed him hot coffee and heated water on the stove for him to warm himself, and she tended to Solomon and got the horse into a dry stall and rubbed him down and removed the shoe he'd thrown somewhere on the road. And all the time she was doing these practical necessary things, she was also conducting a very serious internal negotiation with herself about what she was going to say and what she was going to allow herself to feel. When she came in from the barn, Vernon was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, dry coat draped over a chair near the stove, wearing only his shirt, which was still damp. He had his hands wrapped around the cup and his eyes were half closed with the exhaustion of a man who has been cold and upright for too long. She sat across from him and the wildflowers were still on the windowsill, wilted but still there, and she looked at them and then at him. "I owe you an apology," she said. He opened his eyes fully and looked at her. "What I said 2 days ago," she continued. "I was frightened and I said things that were unkind and not entirely true. You are not just a drifter I hired for odd jobs, and it was dishonest of me to frame it that way." "Rosa," he said, "let me finish." She was gripping her coffee cup. "I have been frightened of needing someone since Emmett died. Probably before that, if I'm honest with myself. And I know what I said felt like a rejection, and I know it was, but it wasn't a rejection of you specifically. It was me being a coward about something I was too scared to look at directly." He waited. "What I was too scared to look at," she said, "was that I care about you, considerably more than is convenient or sensible given our situation. And I was afraid of what that meant, and I handled that fear badly, and you deserved better." The kitchen was warm from the stove, and the rain made its steady sound on the roof, and the lantern on the table burned between them. "Rosa," he said again, and this time his voice had something in it that she recognized because she felt the same thing, something stretched and honest and finally released. He reached across the table and his hand covered hers on the coffee cup, and she let it stay there. "I didn't leave," he said. "I rode out to the creek road and I sat there for 2 hours arguing with myself about whether I had any right to do what I was thinking about doing. And then the sky started going wrong and I came back. And I saw your wagon was gone and the storm was coming fast, and I knew the road markers wouldn't survive that wind." He paused. "I couldn't leave you in the dark." "You held that lantern for 6 hours," she said. "I would have held it for 60, he said simply, "if that's what it took." She turned her hand over beneath his and laced her fingers through his and felt his grip tighten in response with a warmth and sureness that went all the way through her. She said, "What is it you actually want, Vernon? Not from the job, from this, from being here." He looked at her steadily. "I want what I think you already know I want. I need you to say it." He took a breath. "I want to stay, not as an employee, not as a helpful presence who keeps a respectful distance. I want to stay because this is the first place I've stood in longer than I can remember where I actually felt like I was standing somewhere that mattered. Because of the land, but mostly because of you." He paused. "I know that's a significant thing to say to a woman who's been widowed 6 months and who has a complicated situation with her property and who told me 2 days ago to leave." "It is a significant thing to say," she agreed. "If it's too much too soon," he said carefully, "I understand that. I'm not asking you to feel anything you don't feel or to decide anything you're not ready to decide. I just needed you to know why I didn't leave. Why I'm not going to leave unless you genuinely want me to." She looked at him across the table, at his honest, exhausted face and his dark eyes and his hand holding hers with a certainty that he had clearly felt long enough that it was past the point of uncertainty. "I don't genuinely want you to," she said. He nodded slowly and his shoulders dropped the smallest amount, releasing something he had been holding. She squeezed his hand once and then released it and stood up. "You need to sleep. You've been up all night in a rainstorm." He looked at her with something between gratitude and something much softer. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She gave him blankets and he went to the bunkhouse, and she went to her room and lay in the dark listening to the rain slow and stop, and felt something she had been carefully not feeling for months rise up and fill her chest completely. It was not the lightning strike variety of feeling, not the kind of thing that overwhelmed a person's good sense and sent them charging into foolishness. It was the warm, solid sunrise variety. The kind that was already there when you looked for it, that had been building without announcement and was now simply present and obvious and, she decided, very welcome. She slept better than she had since April. The following weeks were different. Not dramatically different in their outward shape. Vernon still worked the land and Rosa still managed the homestead, but the arrangement between them had shifted into something acknowledged and careful and deeply pleasant. He took his meals at the house now rather than at the bunkhouse. They talked in the evenings with the ease of two people who had already done the hard work of beginning to know each other. He made her laugh at dinner once, a real unguarded laugh over something he said about the ornery nature of her cattle, and he looked pleased in a way that was privately delighted and trying not to show it. She caught him trying not to show it and said, "You can be pleased." It was funny. He smiled then, fully, and she realized she had not seen him smile fully before, and it changed his whole face into something younger and less careful, and she felt warmth move through her in a long, slow wave. They were careful with each other, in the way of two people who have both had things break and who are investing in something they want to last. There was no rushing. There was conversation and proximity and small gestures that accumulated weight. The way he always had coffee ready when she came in from the morning feeding. The way she started leaving the better oil lamp in the bunkhouse because she knew he read in the evenings, and the regular one gave poor light. On a Wednesday in late October, they went into Durango together for supplies and to check on the land dispute status. The land office clerk confirmed that Forsyth's claim was proceeding toward dismissal, as the surveyor's marks in Emmett's original filing were clean and irrefutable. Forsyth, it seemed, had overreached. Rosa received this news with quiet satisfaction and bought herself a length of blue fabric from the dry goods store, the first purely personal purchase she had made since before Emmett's illness. On the road home in the wagon, with the afternoon light golden and the mountains clear-edged against the sky, Vernon said, "You should write to your sister." Rosa looked at him. "Made you think of that? You've been thinking about her since that letter, I can tell." She was quiet. "I suppose I have been. She should know you're all right," he said, "and that things are looking better." "Things are looking better," Rosa agreed. She looked at the mountains. "I'll write to her this week." A pause. "I should tell her about you." He glanced at her. "What would you tell her?" She considered. "That I have a man on the property who held a lantern in a rainstorm all night so I could find my way home." She looked at him sidelong, "and that I intend to keep him." Something in his face went very still and then very warm. "That's so," he said. "Unless he has objections," she said. "Not a single one," Vernon said. She wrote to her sister Mary that week. A long letter, the longest she had written in years. She told her about the land dispute and about Forsyth and about the legal resolution and about the homestead. She told her about Vernon Cooper in careful measured sentences that still somehow could not disguise the fact that she was writing about him, the way a person writes about something they are still slightly amazed to have found. She did not hear back for 3 weeks, which was normal given the postal situation. But when Mary's reply came, it was warm and enthusiastic, and contained several pointed questions about Vernon's intentions, which Rosa read aloud to Vernon himself over supper, which made him put down his fork and look at her with an expression caught between amusement and something more serious. "What would you like my intentions to be?" he asked. Rosa set down the letter. She had been thinking about this quietly and thoroughly for 3 weeks. "I'm not in any hurry," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not a woman who needs a ring to feel secure in something." "Understood," he said. But I also want to be honest with you." She folded her hands on the table. "I don't want something that stays in between permanently. I want something real. I want to know that we're building towards something, not tomorrow, but eventually." He looked at her steadily. "Rosa," he said, "I have been thinking about nothing but eventually since approximately the 2nd week I was here." She felt color rise in her face, which irritated her and pleased her in equal measure. "That's very useful information," she said. "I'm glad," he said. He reached across the table and took her hand the way he had on the night of the storm, and she let her fingers close around his, and felt that steady, warm certainty that was his particular quality, the quality that had held a lantern up through 6 hours of rain without flagging. Gerald Forsyth made one more attempt. He came in November without a lawyer this time, and he came with a different approach entirely, which was a personal appeal to Rosa directly. He was charming when he chose to be, and he sat in her parlor with his hat in his hands and spoke about the difficulties of a woman managing a loan and the generosity of the offer on the table and the wisdom of taking security when it was presented. Vernon was at the barn, visible through the window, unhurried about the fact that there was a visitor. Rosa noted that Forsyth kept glancing at him. "I'm not managing a loan," Rosa said pleasantly, "and the offer isn't on the table any longer. My land dispute is resolved in my favor. The water rights are mine. They're going to stay mine." Forsyth looked at her for a moment with something dropping away from his expression, the charm receding to reveal a colder assessment underneath. "That drifter's not going to stay," he said. "Men like that don't." Rosa thought of a lantern held high in a rainstorm for 6 hours. She thought of coffee ready every morning and wildflowers in a tin cup, and the way Vernon Cooper looked at her land with the eyes of someone who loved it almost as much as she did. "You're mistaken about that," she said simply. Forsyth put his hat on and left. She watched him ride away and felt the land dispute close completely, not just legally but in some deeper personal sense, and she went out to the barn and told Vernon what had been said. He listened with his characteristic quiet. "He said men like you don't stay," she told him. "What did you tell him?" "That he was mistaken." Vernon nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with a directness that she had come to understand, was simply his manner when something mattered enough for show to become impractical. "I want to marry you, Rosa. I know it's November and I've been here since July, and there's nothing conventional about any of this. But I know what I want, and I know what you are, and I know what this place is, and I'm asking you to let me stay in the permanent sense, not as a hired hand, as your husband, if you're willing." Rosa looked at him. The barn smelled of hay and horse and cold air coming under the door. Solomon regarded them both from his stall with the magnificent disinterest of a horse who has seen things. "Yes," she said, "just that." Just the single word, said with the same directness he had used, because she was also someone for whom honesty mattered more than performance when something was real enough. He crossed the space between them and took her face in his hands with a tenderness so precise and careful that it made her chest ache, and he kissed her, and she kissed him back with everything she had been holding carefully for months, and it was warm and certain, and nothing like the frightened thing she had been afraid love might become again. They married in December in Halcyon Creek, with Hazel Briggs in attendance and the sheriff who ran the post office, and a handful of other settlers from along the creek, and the preacher who came through from Durango twice a month. Rosa wore the blue fabric she had bought in October, made into a dress by her own careful hands. Vernon wore a clean dark coat and a look of concentrated happiness that people who knew him would have said was foreign to his usual expression if they had known him, which in this territory they did not, but it would not have mattered because it suited him entirely. Hazel Briggs cried openly, which she would have denied if pressed. They spent their first winter as a married couple working the land together, which was not an unromantic way to spend a winter if the people doing it were suited to each other, and Vernon and Rosa were remarkably suited. They were both people of significant competence who respected competence in others. They were both direct and not given to manipulation or false communication. They could be in the same room for extended periods in comfortable silence, which is among the underrated qualities of a lasting partnership. And they could argue without it becoming frightening, which Rosa tested in February when she and Vernon disagreed sharply about whether to sell 4 head of cattle to Callaway's operation, and discovered that he argued with the same steady evenness he brought to everything: no raised voices, no cruelty, just his position and his reasons, and that he listened to hers with genuine attention, and that they reached a compromise that was in fact better than either of their original positions, and that this process left her feeling respected rather than worn down. "We're good at that," she said afterward. "At arguing," he looked slightly amused, "at disagreeing without it becoming a disaster." "Is that a surprise?" she considered. "Frankly, yes. Most of my experience with men in disagreement has not been particularly encouraging," he said. "I was raised by a man who thought conflict meant someone had to win and someone had to lose. It took me a long time to understand that it doesn't have to work that way." He paused. "I've tried to unlearn the things his approach put in me. I'm still working on it." "I appreciate you telling me that," she said. "You should know the things I'm working on," he said simply. "You married them too." She loved him fiercely for that, for the honesty of it, for the willingness to be known imperfectly. Spring came to the Colorado Territory in 1883 with its usual dramatic display, the snowmelt flooding the creek and turning the north pasture briefly into a shallow lake, and coaxing the land back into green, with an enthusiasm that always startled Rosa no matter how many years she witnessed it. The cattle thrived. The irrigation channel Vernon had finished the previous summer performed exactly as intended. The homestead was, by any honest accounting, in better shape than it had been when Emmett was alive, and she acknowledged this without guilt because Emmett would have been glad of it. In April, on the anniversary of Emmett's death, Rosa went alone to the small wooden marker she had placed near the stand of cottonwoods by the creek. She stood there for a while in the spring morning and said the things she needed to say, the gratitude and the grief, and the complicated love of a person who has been left and then gone on living. Vernon did not follow her. He understood that some things required private completion. When she came back to the house, her eyes were red, and he poured her coffee and put it in front of her and sat with her without speaking. And after a while she put her hand over his on the table, and they stayed like that until the feeling passed into something manageable and she was ready to start the day. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't do anything," he said. "Yes, you did," she said. In May she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen after breakfast, in the plain, direct manner that was her way with important things, and she watched his face go through several changes very quickly, the rapid sequence of a person absorbing something enormous and reorganizing around it. The final state his face settled into was something so unguarded and wide open that she felt her throat tighten. He stood up and came around the table and pulled her against him and held her, not dramatically, just with his whole arms and his whole self, the way a person holds something they cannot believe is theirs to hold. She felt him breathe. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice quiet against her hair. "I'm very well," she said. "A little tired, a little overwhelmed, mostly very glad." "I'm very glad," he said. He said it like a person who has just been given the most significant thing they have ever been given and is still working out how to carry it properly. Their son was born in December of 1883, in the bedroom of the homestead on a night that was cold and clear, attended by a midwife who came from Halcyon Creek and who had delivered a considerable number of the territory's children without losing either the child or the mother, a record she maintained successfully. Vernon stayed outside the bedroom for most of it, which was customary, and which cost him considerably, and he came in when the midwife called him, and stood at the bedside looking at Rosa and the infant with an expression that was quite simply the expression of a man completely and helplessly in love with two people at once. They named the boy Emmett Vernon Cooper, which took several conversations and some gentle navigation, but which felt right when they arrived at it. Emmett for the man who had built this place and who had been part of Rosa's life in a real and good way that deserved acknowledgement, and Vernon for the man who was building it further, and Cooper because it was his and now theirs. Little Emmett was, from his first days, a person of decided opinions, which both of his parents found entirely unsurprising and mildly amusing. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was hard, as Colorado winters reliably were, and having an infant made it harder in the practical sense and easier in every other sense, because there is a particular quality of warmth that a new life brings into a household that no amount of firewood can replicate. Vernon was a devoted father from the first, which surprised neither Rosa nor anyone who had known him for more than a few months, because he had always been a person whose loyalties were complete and whose attention was total when given, and he gave both to his son without reservation. Hazel Briggs came to visit in January and held little Emmett and looked at Vernon and Rosa over the baby's head with an expression of unambiguous satisfaction. "I knew it," she said, "when he walked in that first day and asked what she needed most before he even asked about wages. I knew exactly what that was." "You knew nothing," Rosa said, but she was smiling. "I knew everything," Hazel said comfortably. Mary came in the spring of 1884, Rosa's sister Mary, traveling out from Missouri with her husband Thomas and their daughter Ruth, who was 3 years old and deeply interested in the cattle and in Vernon, whom she decided immediately was her personal friend and follower. Vernon received this assignment with the particular gravity a man brings to being chosen by a small child, which is to say he was completely undone by it, and carried Ruth around on his shoulders through the entirety of her visit while she held his hat and directed him where to walk. Rosa watched this from the porch one afternoon and felt the fullness of it, the specific completed quality of a life that had come together from scattered pieces into something solid and whole. Mary found Rosa alone in the kitchen and sat across from her at the table the way family does, without ceremony, with the right to look directly. "You're happy," Mary said. It was not quite a question, but it had a questioning quality, the careful checking of someone who wants to be sure. "I am," Rosa said, "genuinely, not the kind of happy where you're convincing yourself, the kind where you don't have to think about it." Mary studied her. "He's a good man." "He is the best man I know," Rosa said, and said it easily, without drama, the way a person states a thing they are completely certain of. "Emmett was a good man too," Mary said carefully. "Yes," Rosa agreed. "He was. This is not instead of that, it's just what came after. Life comes after if you let it." Mary nodded slowly. "I'm glad you let it," she said. "So am I," Rosa said. Ruth and little Emmett, who was 6 months old and extremely interested in the world, were placed on a blanket together in the warm afternoon, and regarded each other with the grave curiosity of two people who have just discovered that other small people exist and are still assessing the implications. Vernon sat nearby on the porch step, watching them, with the alert readiness of a man who understood that small people near each other required a responsible adult in close proximity. Mary's Thomas got along with Vernon in the way that men of compatible character and modest ego tend to get along, which was without drama, and with mutual respect established quickly and maintained easily through the visit. They talked cattle and land prices and the news from the east, the political situation and the railroad expansion, and the changes moving toward the territory that would eventually change everything about how this land was settled and governed. The territory was changing. It was 1884, and Colorado had been a state since 1876, officially, but statehood in name and statehood in practical effect were different things, and the remote parts of the state were still in many ways frontier, still operating by the older, harder logic of people making their way on land that had not been made easy. Vernon and Rosa had 3 neighbors within a reasonable distance: the Callaways to the north, the Brennan family to the east, and an older couple named Hatch who had been on their land since before Colorado was a state and who knew the land and the weather patterns and the soil better than anyone. The Hatches were childless and aging and sometimes needed help, and Vernon had taken it on himself to check on them through the winter, which Rosa had noticed, and which had told her something she already knew about the quality of his character, but which she appreciated confirming. The Halcyon Creek community was small and in some respects still rough, still shaped by the distances and the isolation and the requirement of self-reliance that frontier life imposed. There were injustices woven into the fabric of the territory that Rosa saw clearly, and that sometimes made her grief and anger rise up. The way that the Ute people had been pushed from this land was something she knew about and could not unfeel when she thought about it. The treaties that had been made and unmade, the removal of 1880 that had sent people from their ancestral territory by force, the land she now stood on having a history that predated Emmett's deed and Forsyth's consortium, and everything that any of them called settled or legal. She talked about this with Vernon one evening, and he listened and did not offer comfortable reassurances, because he didn't have any, only said that knowing the history of a place and sitting with the discomfort of it was at least better than not knowing it, and that the best thing they could do was to treat the land with care and to treat other people with justice in the dealings they could actually influence. It was not enough to solve anything large, but it was honest, and honesty was what she had. The following summer brought a drought that tested everyone along the creek. It was not the worst drought the territory had seen, but it was serious. The creek running low and the grass burning brown in August, and the cattle needing to be moved to protect the north pasture from overgrazing. Vernon managed this with the practiced competence of a man who had spent years in country where water was the central fact of everything, and the herd came through it in reasonable shape, and the irrigation channel that he had finished in that first summer proved its worth by keeping the kitchen garden alive through the driest weeks. The Brennans to the east were not as fortunate. Their well ran low in August, and Jim Brennan rode over looking hollowed out and ashamed of having to ask, and Vernon took him out to the creek and showed him where the best water was still running and spent 2 days helping Brennan dig an extension on his water access that solved the immediate problem and refused any payment for it. Rosa, watching from the yard, thought about a man who had packed his belongings when she told him to leave and come back through a rainstorm to hold a lantern up through the dark. She thought that character was consistent. It showed up the same way in every weather and every circumstance. She went inside and wrote another letter to Mary. She was trying to describe Vernon to her sister in terms that did justice to the reality of him, and she was finding, as she had found each time she tried, that the biggest things about him were the simplest ones. Not dramatic, not grand gestures of the showy variety, just the consistent steadiness of a man who showed up for what mattered, who held the lantern up all night, who stayed. She wrote, "He is the kind of man who does not require you to thank him for the right thing because he has already moved on to the next right thing. I find this occasionally maddening and entirely wonderful." Mary wrote back, "This is exactly what love sounds like when it's real." Rosa read this letter twice and then put it in the box where she kept the letters from Mary, which was filling up at a satisfying rate. In the autumn of 1885, they had a second child, a daughter this time, who arrived in October with considerably less ceremony than her brother had, as though she had assessed the situation and decided it did not require extensive drama. They named her Clara Rose Cooper, and she was from her first weeks the temperamental opposite of Emmett, who had been a decided and opinionated baby, while Clara seemed to have come into the world with a settled contentment that she did not ever seem in a hurry to disturb. Little Emmett, who was nearly 2, regarded his sister with the cautious assessment of a small person, encountering something new and potentially significant. After 3 days, he appeared to have concluded that she was acceptable and began a program of bringing her things he considered important, mostly small rocks, and once a remarkably large beetle, which Rosa removed before Clara could do anything unfortunate with it. Vernon watched his son present offerings to his daughter, with a look that Rosa had learned over 3 years to recognize as his deepest happiness, the quiet, steady variety that he wore without announcing it. She came to stand beside him in the doorway of the bedroom where the children were. "You look satisfied," she said. "I am satisfied," he said, profoundly and entirely. She leaned her shoulder against his arm and he put his arm around her, and they stood watching their son carefully arrange 3 smooth creek stones in a line beside his infant sister, explaining something to her in the serious babbling of a not quite 2-year-old, Clara gazing at him with her characteristic settled interest. "Vernon," Rosa said, "do you ever think about Texas, where you're from?" He was quiet a moment. "Sometimes. Why? I just wonder sometimes what you gave up to stay here. Whether there are things or people you miss." He thought about this honestly in the way he thought about things. "I miss my brother James sometimes, the one who's still on the family land. We were close when we were boys." He paused. "I should write to him. I should tell him about all of this." "You should," Rosa said. "I don't miss Texas itself," he said. "Texas was a place I was passing through, even when I was living in it, if that makes sense. I never felt planted there." He looked at the room, at the children, at the lamp burning on the dresser. "I feel planted here. I feel like I put my roots down into something real." He looked at her. "Into you specifically, but also this land. This life." She turned her face up toward his and he kissed her temple, which was a small, ordinary thing and enormously good. "I'm glad you didn't listen to me," she said, "when I told you to leave. I'm glad the road was dark," he said, "and I happened to have a lantern." She laughed, a genuine warm laugh, and he smiled his full smile, the one she had first seen over dinner and which had not lost anything by becoming familiar. He did write to his brother James, a long letter that fall, and James wrote back within a month, a letter full of news from Texas that was warm and somewhat surprised by the story of Vernon's life, and which expressed a hope to visit sometime that sounded like a genuine intention rather than mere politeness. They had been exchanging letters since, and it had the quality of a long-interrupted conversation, resuming, carefully, with the particular effort of 2 people who had both changed considerably, and were interested in knowing who the other had become. The land dispute was long settled by now. Forsyth's consortium had, it emerged, overextended itself in several places along with Halcyon Creek and had quietly retreated from the area. The water rights along the creek remained with the individual homesteaders, which was as it should have been, and Callaway to the north and the Brennans to the east, and the Hatches had all kept their places, which meant the valley remained a collection of people rather than a single commercial operation, which was better for everyone in it. The homestead grew. In 1887, they added a second barn when the herd had grown large enough to require it, working on it through the summer with help from the Brennan brothers, who were strong and cheerful, and who ate enormous quantities of food at the noon meal and were worth every biscuit. The new barn was larger than the original and had a proper hayloft and stalls for 12 horses. Not that they had 12 horses yet, but Vernon had said it was better to build for what you were growing toward than to build for where you were, and Rosa had agreed, and they had built the larger barn. Little Emmett was 4 now and already trying to be useful in the way of a child who has observed useful adults his whole brief life and has concluded that this is the correct approach to existence. He followed Vernon around the property with focused seriousness, asking questions that were occasionally unanswerable and always interesting. Vernon answered them all, even the unanswerable ones, with a patience and honesty that Rosa observed and appreciated every time she witnessed it. "Pa," Emmett said one morning, sitting on the fence while Vernon checked the north pasture gate, "where do you go when you die?" Vernon didn't pause in his examination of the gate hinge. "I don't know for certain," he said. "Some people believe one thing and some people believe another." "What do you believe?" Vernon considered. "I believe that the people who love us don't forget us, and I believe the things we build stay built for a long time after we're gone." He looked at his son. "Does that help?" Emmett thought about it with the gravity of a 4-year-old engaging with a genuinely difficult question. "I think so," he decided. Rosa, coming from the garden with an armful of late-season squash, had heard all of this and said nothing, but she thought about it for the rest of the day. The things we build stay built. She looked at her house and her barn and her irrigation channel and her small herd and her husband at the fence and her children and thought that this was true, and that the building was not finished, and that she was glad. Clara, who was 2 now and had moved from settled contentment into energetic exploration of everything within her reach, was at that moment escaping from the kitchen where she had been left with a toy and heading at considerable speed toward the chicken yard, which was her current area of fascination. Rosa changed direction and intercepted her without breaking stride, scooping her up, and Clara shrieked with delight at being caught. Emmett watched this from the fence and then looked back at his father. "Ma's fast," he observed. "Your mother," Vernon said, "is remarkable in every respect." Emmett accepted this as established fact. That evening, with both children asleep and the house quiet, and the autumn stars brilliant through the kitchen window, Vernon and Rosa sat at the table where they had sat through so many conversations. The table that had held coffee cups and account books and legal documents and letters from sisters in Missouri and tin cups of wildflowers, and they talked about what the next year might look like. The herd was large enough now that they should be thinking about a proper market relationship, a contract with one of the Durango buyers rather than the ad hoc arrangements they had been managing. Vernon had been corresponding with a cattle buyer named Patterson who had a solid reputation and fair dealing, and Rosa had read the correspondence and agreed that Patterson seemed like the right choice. Emmett's schooling was coming up. Halcyon Creek had acquired a teacher the previous year, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Hartley, who was 22 and serious about her work, and who had already impressed Rosa considerably. Emmett would start in the spring, and there were books to acquire and preparations to make. They talked about James possibly visiting from Texas in the summer, and about where they would put him, and whether the bunkhouse needed repairs before it could house a guest. They talked about the Hatches, who were now in their mid-70s and whose farm was becoming more than they could manage, and about whether there was a way to help without offending the fierce independence that people of that generation wore like armor. Vernon thought perhaps a simple arrangement of mutual assistance, a formalized version of what was already happening, might thread that particular needle. They talked about nothing especially dramatic or large. They talked about the ordinary ongoing life of 2 people building something together, and this was, Rosa thought, the actual substance of love. Not the lantern in the storm, though that was real and she would never forget it. But this. The table and the lamp and the quiet house and the 2 voices making plans in the particular shorthand of people who know each other well and intend to keep knowing each other for a very long time. She reached across the table and took his hand. "Vernon," she said. "Rosa," he said, in the same tone, which was a game they had developed, mirroring the gravity of a name with a name. "I want to tell you something." "All right. I was wrong about you," she said. "In the beginning, when I called you a drifter with no fixed address." She paused. "You are the most fixed person I have ever known, the most staid person. Everything about you is staid." He looked at her steadily, and she could see in his eyes the same thing she felt when she looked at him, which was the clean, unfrightened recognition of someone who has found the right place and the right person and knows it without qualification. "You were right that I was a drifter," he said. "Past tense applies." "Past tense applies," she agreed. She stood and blew out the kitchen lamp, and they went to their room, and the house settled into the sounds of its own deep contentment. The creak of timber and the soft breathing of sleeping children, and the creak making its patient sound in the dark outside. The same creak it had always been, the same dark, and somewhere in the yard the memory of a lantern held high by a man who would not leave someone alone in the dangerous night. A man who had known, before she did, that the road was dark and she didn't know it yet. A man who had decided, without announcement or drama or any request for gratitude, to be the light. In the spring of 1888, the Hartley School acquired a second teacher, which meant that the Halcyon Creek community had grown enough to require two, and Rosa helped organize the community effort to build a second room onto the schoolhouse, spending 3 weekends in a row with other women from the area, and several of the men, including Vernon, who could frame a wall correctly and knew it, and worked alongside everyone else without making a thing of knowing it. The schoolhouse addition was completed on a Saturday in May, and Miss Hartley and the new teacher, a Mr. Aldrich, who was from Pennsylvania and was still adjusting to the altitude, both expressed proper gratitude, and the community had a supper afterward that went late into the warm evening with considerable talking and some fiddle music from Jim Brennan's oldest boy, who had discovered a talent for it. Rosa danced with Vernon for the first time that evening, in the yard of the schoolhouse with stars overhead and fiddle music, and the other families of Halcyon Creek around them, and she thought with sudden clarity that she had never danced with him before, had never had occasion to, and that this was something she intended to rectify regularly going forward. He was, to her complete lack of surprise, a competent dancer, not a showy one, just competent as he was at everything, moving with the same easy economy of motion that characterized all his physical work. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked. "Texas," he said. "There were dances." "You keep surprising me," she said. He looked down at her with that look, the full, warm, steady one. "Good," he said. Emmett, who was 5, had been dancing with complete uninhibited enthusiasm since the music started, with his sister, and with Hazel Briggs, who had come from Halcyon Creek, and with a small red-haired girl from the Calloway family, who was his particular friend at school. Clara watched him with her characteristic thoughtful expression, and then joined in with her own interpretation of the proceedings, which bore limited relationship to either the music or the formal structure of the dance, but which was entirely joyful. Vernon and Rosa stood at the edge of the lamplight and watched their children dance, and Vernon's arm was around her shoulders, and her head was resting briefly against him, and the evening was warm and smelled of new grass and wood smoke from the fires that had been lit for cooking. "Are you happy?" he asked her, quietly, privately, under the music. She thought about the question with the genuine attention it deserved. She thought about Missouri and the journey west and Emmett Lockhart, and what it had cost to love someone and lose them. She thought about the frightened widow who had stood in a yard in July 1882 and told a drifter she didn't need his charity. She thought about a rainstorm and a lantern and 6 hours in the dark, and the single most important journey she had ever made through those last miles to her own front yard. She thought about morning coffee and account books and irrigation channels and fence posts, and legal documents and wildflowers in a tin cup, and letters from Missouri and babies who brought their sisters rocks. She thought about the table where they sat in the evenings and made plans. She thought about all of it, the whole of it, the ordinary and the extraordinary woven together until they were one continuous thing. "Yes," she said, "completely." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and she felt it go all the way through her. The fiddle played on. The children danced. The stars overhead were the same stars that had shone on the Colorado Territory since before anyone had given it that name. The same stars under which two people had stood in a rainy yard 3 years before and begun the long, wonderful work of finding out who they were going to be to each other. The lantern had been burning for 6 hours, and it had been enough, and everything that came after it was the proof of that. The accumulated daily proof of a love that had been built carefully and honestly and with full knowledge of the cost of both caring and losing, and which was, as they stood in the schoolhouse yard in the May evening with their children's laughter in the air around them, absolutely and entirely worth it. The road had been dark. He had held the light. She had found her way home, and they had stayed.